and in this lecture, we will be going over the Books2 project. What will we be creating in Books2? Well, we will be creating a real Python object that handles all components of a book. This includes an ID of type UUID, a title of type string, an author of type string, a description of type string, and a rating of type integer. Now, one thing you may notice is that the title, author, description, and rating is all equal to field. Field comes from Pydantic that allows our APIs to do data validation automatically on the data coming in from the client. And of course, we will be making Books2 work with all the CRUD operations, get, post, put, and delete. And in this section, we'll be diving even deeper into the technology and theory of FastAPI. We'll be learning about exception handlers, custom exception handlers, schema configs, headers, and more. Now in the Books2 project, we will see how different APIs are when dealing with Python objects from dictionaries. We will be using request bodies to send data during post and put request methods, do data validation, and raise appropriate HTTP exceptions based on the request and the response needed. Our APIs will look very familiar from the URL perspective compared to Books1. However, the big difference between the code is drastic when comparing the two applications. We will be using get with an empty URL to get all the books, get with a UUID as a path parameter to get a specific book, put with a UUID path parameter and a request body of a JSON book to update a specific book, post with a JSON request body to add a book, and delete with a path parameter of a UUID to delete a book. So once again, we will be covering all CRUD operations. This wraps up the lecture on Books2 project overview, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to be creating a new books.py file that we're now going to be creating books that are now objects using the base model, which will allow us to now send objects as requests and responses from our APIs. So the first thing I'm going to do is hover over my FastAPI parent directory, right click, new Python file, and I'm going to call this file books2.py. Now inside Books2, we need to import FastAPI, and we also then need to create the variable app, which is equal to FastAPI. So from FastAPI, import FastAPI. And now I'm going to create the variable app, which is equal to FastAPI. And now I'm going to create an empty list called books. And lastly, I'm going to create an API using the @app decorator with a getRequest method. And then we're going to create a function, readAllBooks, that just returns all of the books in the list. And as of right now, the list is empty. So when we call the API, it should return just an empty list. But we'll try it out anyway. So @app.get, and then as a parameter, I'm going to say a empty string. And under the decorator, I'm going to create the function. So async def read all books with no parameters. And then finally, I'm just going to return books. All right, so now let's fire up our server by typing in uvicorn books2 :app -- reload. All right, let's now open up our browser, refresh it, and we can see that we get our API of get read all books. If I open this up, we can see that it takes no parameters. a 200 successful response, and it's going to return just a string. So let's select try it out and execute. And with the curl command, calling our URL and port, we can see that we get a successful response of an empty body, which is exactly what books is. We made a new books, which is an empty body, and we are returning that books as of right now. This wraps up setting up our new project, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to create a books object. And now this object is going to have different variables that defines a book. However, we're going to be creating this object using BaseModel. BaseModel is from Pydantic. And Pydantic is a data validation and settings management that you can use with Python and type annotations. What makes Pydantic useful is it enforces type hints at runtime, and it provides user-friendly errors when data is being validated and invalidated. So I'm going to show you in this lecture how we can use Pydantic and how to create a books object. Now the first thing we need to import is BaseModel from Pydantic. So we can say from Pydantic import BaseModel. And we're going to import UUID, which is a universal unique identifier. A UUID is a 128-bit label used for information in computer systems. We're going to be using this universal unique identifier as our ID of our books as our primary key within a list, so when we want to enhance it or create new books, we can now properly distribute each object from one another within the list. We can import UUID from UUID and then importing UUID. And now under app, which is equal to FastAPI, I'm going to create a new class called book. And I'm going to make it extend from BaseModel. We can do this by saying class book, and within the parentheses we can say BaseModel. And now we need to define variables within book. The first thing we can say is we need an ID, which is going to be of type UUID. We also want a title, which is going to be of type string, an author, which is of type string. Maybe we can add description of type string, and then a rating where a user can validate and rate how good they think the book is, maybe on a scale of 1 to 100. So ID is going to be UUID. The title is going to be a string. The author will also be a string. Description will be a string. And then lastly, rating will be an integer. Now, this is how you create a class using BaseModel as the reference or extending the BaseModel ability to now create an object within Python that's going to be using ID, title, author, description, and rating. And since we are using book and extending BaseModel, it's going to come with automatic validation and data validation, which is going to be extremely helpful as we progress and create APIs that are going to be dealing with books. This wraps up this first lecture on how to create a book using BaseModel, and I will see you in the next video. In this lecture, we're going to be dealing with a request method of post. So we're going to be sending a book as a request, and then we're going to be processing that on the server, which is our Books2 program. And then we're going to be responding back to the client with a response of the book. So this is an awesome opportunity where we can deal with the requesting and the responsing between a client and server. So let's dive in. I'm going to start by clicking enter a few times so we can get an extra space on our IDE. And the first thing we want to do is to create an @app decorator of post that's going to be an empty URL. And now right under the decorator, we're going to create a new function called async def create book. And as the parameter, we're going to pass in an object. So I'm going to say book of type book. And now immediately, FastAPI is going to know that this is not a query parameter like we were using before. Since we're dealing with a base model object, FastAPI is going to be expecting this in the body of the API request. Once we get the book, we're going to want to say books.append book. So we're going to add this book to the list of empty books that we currently have. And now simply we want to return the book. So if we successfully append the book, then we just want to return the book back to the user so they can see what was processed and see the 200 successful status code along with the book that was successfully added. All right, now let's save our application and let's open up our browser. I'm going to refresh our page and we can see that we have this read all books that we currently had already and a new API called create book. Now we can see that a request body is required. We need to send in a request body along with this API URL to be able to successfully process this application. And right underneath, it tells us an example of what the request body should look like. We're going to need an ID, which is a random UUID. We're going to need a title, which is a string, an author, which is a string, a description, which is a string, and a rating that is an integer. So let's say try it out. So when you say try it out, we get this text box where we are able to enhance and change the request body. So the UUID, we will keep the same. This is going to be the identifier we're going to be using as a primary key of the book object that we're creating. I'm going to call the title Computer Science Pro. By coding with Roby. And for the description, I'm going to say how to become the best developer. And I'm going to give it a rating of 100. And now I'm going to execute this API request. Now let's look at this curl request. We can see that it's a post with our URL and our path parameters, which is going to be completely empty. We have two headers, which is application JSON. And then we have inside this /d, we have the request body. And again, we have our ID, which is a unique identifier. We have our title, Computer Science Pro, our author, Coding with Roby, our description, how to become the best developer with a rating of 100. And then as a response body, we get the exact same information with a status code of 200. If we scroll back to the top and say read all books and say try it out and execute, we can see that now within books, we have one book with the ID, title, author, description, rating that we created. Now let's go back down to our post. Now let's eliminate an entire section that's required, like author. And now we wanted to say execute. We can see that we get a 422 status code error with unprocessable entity. We get an object of detail, which is body and author, with message of field required, value error missing. So what's happening is we are missing a line of our object that is required, but FastAPI during this validation process using Pydantic, it automatically looks up each one of these required fields and validates it against the request to make sure that the client is sending in all the correct information to properly process this API. This is super powerful stuff that FastAPI does automatically for you. Let's now go back to Swagger and let's add in that author that's currently missing. And instead of a string, let's make author equal to an integer. If we execute this, we can see that FastAPI automatically turns that integer into a string because that's exactly what we were looking for author. We needed author to be a string, so FastAPI again does data validation to turn this integer into a string during the parsing of the book object. This wraps up how we're going to create a post request method using a request body of book, and I will see you in the next video.